Good evening and a warm welcome to the German Institute for Japanese Studies. My name is Sebastian Paul Grottmann. I'm a researcher here at this institute, and together with my colleague Nicole Müller, I'm happy to welcome you to this co-hosted event with the Sophia University. It is the DIJ-Sophia Sustainability Forum on who is scared of the climate crisis and who just doesn't care. So without further ado, let me now introduce our second speaker, Professor Carola Hommerich, to you. She is professor at the Department of Sociology at the Faculty of Human Sciences at Sophia University here in Tokyo. And she also used to be a researcher, just as Nicole and I am right now here at the DIJ, so she is a senpai of ours as well. So it's a great honor to welcome you here today. And she has been doing research on well-being and social status, but more recently also on the topic of sustainability and on environmental attitudes and behavior, especially here in Japan. Her most recent publications include Sustainable Societies in a Fragile World, Perspectives from Germany and Japan, and also her research appeared in several international journals, such as the Social Indicators Research or the Social Sciences Japan Journal, among many others. So, Carola, the floor is all yours.
Okay, so hi, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here, but the pleasure is somewhat halved because my co-speaker, Untitled Neckel, unfortunately is sick. So yesterday we worked on the last versions of the presentation. He was already coughing and not doing well, and no chance. So today, unfortunately, he was really knocked out. But fortunate for me, he is somebody who writes a script for presentations. So the script was already ready, so I can deliver his part of the talk, and I will do my very best to make it as round as possible. But yes, very unfortunate for us that he won't be here for the Q&A, because he really is an expert on topics of sustainability, but also on the sociology of emotion. So the core idea was to have a presentation together. Before I start, I also quickly just explaining why we have this collaboration at all. So Untitled Neckel has been working on topics of sustainability, like I said, but also climate emotions, and he has co-authored a paper on this, which made me interested in thinking about this, like what's the significance of emotional engagement with the climate crisis. And I happened to also know him, meet him, and we discussed this and thought about this. It may be a nice opportunity to include some questions about this inner survey that I have carried out during the late summer here in Japan, which I will be reporting on. And then based on this, we applied, and he is here now as a JSPS short-term fellow for another week now, and then he will return. But this is also an outcome of our work together. Okay, let me start, and let me just quickly check how I will do this properly so that I do not have too much paper sound. Okay, so who is scared of the climate crisis and who just doesn't care? Climate emotions and their significance for environmental attitudes and behavior in Japan. And maybe just to kind of contextualize this a little bit, most of you are here in Japan, know about it, etc. So Japan has pledged to be carbon neutral in 2050. But it's very questionable whether that will be possible to reach, especially when we look at its performance. And this is the Climate Change Performance Index, which is an index that compares 67 countries that are responsible for 90% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And this just came out yesterday. It's the newest version. They rank countries. This is now filtered by G20. And where's Japan? So Japan ranks overall amongst these 67 countries, 57. Really, really low, not doing well. And criticism is very much about, or the core criticism is about inadequate policy roadmap to achieve the climate goals, and also no clear, consistent plan for how to exit the use of fossil fuels. I mean, the idea is to continue usage, etc. Right? So, not really doing well. At the same time, however, we clearly feel the impact of climate change increasing. So in case you live here and you've lived through the summer, you will know what I'm talking about. So year on year, summers are hotter. We have records of people with heat strokes in the hospital, etc. The heat also affects agriculture by harming crops like rice, very famously a big topic this year, but also fishing, where traditionally beloved species like summer, they move to colder waters, it's harder to catch them, etc. And of course also very disruptive extreme weathers like wildfires, droughts and floods, landslides, etc. This is all happening in Japan, and it's very visible, really, so you should think people are quite aware of this happening. And so they are. So not surprisingly, concern about the climate crisis is high. So here I show you data from an international comparison by the research institute Ipsos, and they carried out this research. It's from the beginning of this year, where they compare 32 different countries, and they ask, so how concerned are you about the impact of climate change that you are seeing in your country? So in this case, Japan. And so here, where is Japan? For Japan, 81% of people say that they are concerned. And that is an increase from 2022, where it was still 69%. So people are more concerned. That is, first of all, something we can note. But the perceived urgency to do something about it is not that high, or rather it's weakening. So perceived urgency to act is waning. So here the same survey also asked asked people to say how they feel about this statement. If individuals like me do not act now to combat climate change, we will be failing future generations. And here for Japan, so the percentage of people who agreed with this was 40%, and that's the lowest of all the countries in the survey. And it's also 19% less than in 2021. So less people feel that way. Similarly, so only 42% of respondents felt that their government needed to take action urgently to combat climate change. And this is not necessarily, so here you can see that's also the lowest number across all countries, and it's down from 70% in 2021. Now it's only 42%. And you could say, okay, maybe because the government is now doing all kinds of stuff, but that's not really what we see, because only 11% felt that the Japanese government was a world leader in terms of climate change. So it's not really a perception that the government is already doing enough, and that's why we respond in this way. So what we find here is a concerning mismatch between lived reality, where we have a clear impact of climate change on daily lives, and then the perceived urgency to act. And we find something very similar also in our own data. And so now let me move on to explain about the survey that I will mainly be speaking about today. So this is a survey that I carried out, or we as a team. It's not just Zikat Neckel and I, but also other members, Takeshi Ito from Sophia University, Joanna Kitznig, and also Susumu Onuma, who's from Hokkaido University. It's a research project funded by Sophia, where we look at, or we research on, investigate environmental attitudes, specifically attitudes toward climate change and also behavior, etc. On the one hand, through a quantitative survey, but we also carry out qualitative interviews, which I will not be talking about today. So this is the survey. It's an online survey of 5,000 respondents, which is very large. We have the respondents are members of an online survey panel from the social research company Neo Marketing, and it's the sample. It's people between 15 to 74, and we had a quota for age, gender, and prefecture, which makes the sample proportional to the basic resident registry. So what this means essentially is that the data that we have is a very good picture of the Japanese population in that age range. Okay. And it was carried out late August to early September this year, so really when we're at the end of a super hot summer in Japan. So you would think people are very aware of lots of things. Okay, so what do we find here in our own survey? So here I have made, maybe just as a bit of an explanation, so in the presentation I tried to display data in a relatively easy to digest format. So I'm not showing too complex statistics, etc., but I hope it's then easier to just take in. So here we asked them also, how concerned are you about climate change? And then on the scale from 1 to 6, the people who would say 4, 5, or 6, very concerned, we would here count as concerned. And so overall, 76% or so are concerned, which is also similar to the Ipsos survey. But you can see how this is different across age groups. Concern is lower in the younger age groups. It's lowest in the group of the 20 to 29-year-olds. There it's still high, right? Still 64% are concerned, but it's lower. So that's maybe the point. And interestingly, and this is also a consistent pattern throughout, the youngest, 15 to 19, and like I said, we have 5,000 people, so we have also a sizable group of people in this youngest group, so it makes sense to also interpret these percentages. They are a bit more concerned, and this kind of is something we find throughout. Okay, concern, we can still say it's high, it's lower amongst the younger, but it's still high. But then we also included a question that asks about interest in the topic of climate change, and we purposely asked it in a way that makes it easier to say, yeah, okay, really, I'm not so interested. So we didn't ask, are you interested? But we asked them to say whether or not they agreed with the statement, I'm not very interested in climate change. And there we find, and let me explain, so we find that a total of 41.7% say that they strongly agree or somewhat agree with this statement, or neither agree or disagree. I think when somebody isn't able to make up their mind about this statement, it means they're not interested. So I think it's fair enough to interpret like this. This, again, is stronger. Same pattern emerges where we have younger age groups being less interested. They were also less concerned. So amongst the 20 to 29-year-olds, we have, if we count the neither nor category, then we have 60% and a little bit more, over 60% who say that they're not really interested in this topic. And again, however, super little difference there, but the youngest are slightly more interested. Still also there, it's quite strong that they're not saying that they're not really so interested. So how do these two answers or these two results of high concern and low interest, so how does that fit together? And this brings me to our research question. So what explains this seemingly paradoxical reaction or outcome, I guess we could say? And so one question that today I hope to at least give you some results for is which parts of the population care about climate change and which do not care so much. And also, so this is more about the actual descriptive data that what do we find in the sample. And another question is more about how do different concepts or different things relate to each other. So how are cognitive and emotional perceptions of the climate change crisis related to pro-climate behaviors? That's the second part that I want to say something about. This is the point in time where usually I would go away and Zikard would move in. I will not try to imitate his voice. This would be today, so I'm not going to do that. But so, like I said, he left. I have his script, so I will now read his script and explain his part about the theoretical background of thinking about climate emotions. Okay, so concern and interest, different concepts, and how can we deal with this? So to better understand the paradoxical combination of high concern about climate change and low interest in it, it's helpful to distinguish between the concepts of concern and interest. Interest calls for information and knowledge and should therefore be understood as a cognitive category. Cognitive interest is a necessary but not sufficient condition for climate-friendly behavior. And this is indicated in previous findings from social science research on environmental awareness, particularly with regard to explaining the so-called attitude-behavior gap. A widely used model to explain the persistence of environmentally harmful behavior despite better knowledge. So we know it, but we don't act on it. For a long time, the public has assumed that increased awareness of the negative consequences of their lifestyles would lead to behavioral change through rational insight, a belief that has often been proven wrong. Accordingly, many studies in environmental sociology have demonstrated that increased knowledge of ecological dangers is not a sufficient prerequisite for individuals to change their environmental behavior. While environmental knowledge remains important, it only partially translates into corresponding conduct or behavior. Although general knowledge about climate risks has increased significantly in recent decades, this appears to have had little effect on the prevalence of climate-damaging behavior. However, the likelihood of such behavior apparently increases when the individuals involved not only have the knowledge about climate change, as evidenced by possibly their interest in the topic, I'm not really sure that that always goes hand in hand, but are also concerned about global warming. So concern is an expression of a personally felt sense of being affected, making it a category from the field of emotions. If people are emotionally affected by the dangers of climate change, they are apparently more willing to behave in a climate-friendly manner. This relates to the so-called signaling function, going back to Sigmund Freud, of emotions. They indicate the personal significance of an event or a development. So emotions give certain objects of our perception special importance and are therefore crucial for motivating behavior. Against this backdrop, it's not surprising that the emotional world of climate change has received increased attention in environmental sociology in recent years. Numerous studies have concluded in this respect that the emotional involvement with ecopathologies is highly important when it comes to recognizing the climate crisis as a crisis of humanity and acting accordingly. Emotions enable personal access to the realization of the ecological emergency in which we find ourselves. Climate emotions, to be short, can be conducive to anchoring abstract insights into the effects of climate change and environmental degradation in one's consciousness. Moreover, they can be an effective impulse for social commitment and the willingness to behavioral changes. Particularly in the context of increasing skepticism and denial of climate change, emotions seem to be crucial but are often misunderstood in public discourse. The emotionality of discourses over climate and environmental protection is not, as it often is perceived, an indication of its irrationality. Instead, it reflects the internal significance that the problem of the destruction of nature has in the subjective self-image of actors. Some emotions are particularly important in this respect. These include fear and anxiety, guilt and shame, grief and mourning. Anxiety is generally characterized by the expectation of an impending disaster, by the anticipation of dangers to which actors feel helpless against. Amongst the general public, fears and anxiety mostly arise as climate emotions when experiences of environmental disasters such as heat waves or droughts or large fires give people the feeling that climate change and its dangers are real. Being able to bear anxiety is a vital part of being able to face reality. In numerous studies on the ecological crisis, people reported that repeated hot summers, seemingly never-ending bushfires, or recurring hurricanes have triggered feelings of fear. Climate change, which is often perceived as a temporally and spatially more distant danger that does not directly affect us personally, then enters the consciousness of the present. Fears and anxiety can trigger an inner compulsion to realize the dangers of climate change. This effective mechanism can also create a public climate that encourages engagement with the issues of global warming and establishes a consensus that climate change poses a significant threat and must be urgently addressed. Shame regularly occurs when actors fear that violations of norms will become known to those whom they wish to appear compliant with. By undermining the expectations that others place on you, the fear of being shamed arises as an effective warning signal that indicates the danger of losing respect and social bonds with relevant others. In times of climate change, lifestyles such as excessive meat consumption, disposable consumption, or all-inclusive tourism, cruises, and air travel carry the potential risk of losing respect by certain peers. This is not necessarily research on Japan, just to keep that in mind. And in their study on the topic of flight shame, so flight shame is when You feel ashamed for flying, taking the airplane to go somewhere because you know it's bad for the environment, and your surrounding also knows it and kind of lets you feel it. So in their study on the topic of flight shame, 2 Swedish sociologists, Maria Wohlrath Söderberg and Nina Worms, in a paper from 2019, have shown the various repercussions of guilt and shame. Based on interviews with people who stated that they had voluntarily stopped flying, the study concluded that although the change in behavior was also triggered by greater knowledge, it was accompanied by strong feelings of shame and guilt. Numerous interview partners referred to the fact that the consequences of their air travel for third parties mobilized strong personal feelings of shame. Above all, they articulated the desire to have their personal behavior be consistent with their own demands. Thus, in their study, the Swedish sociologists found support for their view that flight shame is evidence of how ecological norms spreading among peers impact the reasoning about flying and the choice to stay on the ground. Finally, grief and mourning are important emotions in the public response to the climate crisis. Grief, as pain over the loss of something irreplaceable, can refer not only to the loss of loved ones, but also to the loss of natural habitat, including landscapes, forests, lakes, glaciers, animals, or plants. Studies from Canada, Australia, and Norway have shown that melting sea ice, drained farmland, disappearing snow, and extinct animal life can trigger mourning and deep feelings of grief. This grief is often linked to a feeling of having lost one's own cultural identity as a result of effects of climate change, of having become ecologically homeless. Physical ecological losses can translate into melancholic moods and evoke nostalgic memories of times when landscapes, wildlife, or seasons were still experienced as intact. This was the kind of more theoretical background on climate emotions, and now I move on to, again, my part. I'm now me again, and move on to explaining how what of this we included in the survey and what we find about this. Okay, let me remind you of the 2 core questions. So which parts of the population care about climate change and which do not, and how are cognitive and emotional perceptions of the climate crisis related to climate-friendly behaviors? So how do we do this? On the one hand, so I will introduce the different things that we measure, and I will also tell you something about how these, for example, climate-friendly behaviors, how are they distributed in the population, etc., so that you also get some information about that. And then I will explain the model. So we have a dependent variable, the outcome variable, climate-friendly behaviors, and our independent variables. We want to know how climate knowledge and climate emotions are related to climate-friendly behaviors, and we have different control variables that we also look at. Okay, but let me first introduce what we measure here. So climate-friendly behavior is, first of all, something that you have to consider how to measure. We here use 7 items for this, or 7 different types of behavior that we asked people about how frequently they engage in them or not. So some very common ones: I refuse excessive packaging and bring my own shopping bags when I shop. Or the next one is about recycling, which often is claimed to not, or I know from other surveys, claims not super useful in Japan because everybody has to kind of do it. But actually in our survey we find that not everybody does it. Younger people are much less likely to do it. Or I carry my own reusable bottle or cup, or make a conscious effort to eat less meat, or I avoid buying fast fashion, etc. We also have questions about climate activism, but I do not include them here because activism in terms of a demonstration, etc., it's such a small share of people who actually do this that it's not really great in this kind of model. So we make a composite index of these that we use, but very quickly. So who's more likely, before going into the model, who's more likely to engage in climate-friendly behavior? In general, very strong difference in terms of gender. So women are generally more likely to do this. This is not necessarily only the case in Japan. Older age groups are more likely to engage in these behaviors. People with higher education are more likely to engage in it. Least likely is, again, the age group of the 20 to 39-year-olds. And we find slightly less engagement in very rural areas, but I think that's a super small group of 200 something people who live in like really, or they say that they live in very rural areas, like super small villages. And I think some of these behaviors are just not relevant there, or maybe not something you can do even, right? So I'm not really sure, but there we find, I'm not really sure how reliable that finding is. Just some data to show you for some of these items. I'm not going to show all of them, so I always just pick out a few. So I refuse excessive packaging and bring my own shopping bags when I shop. So here you can see, first of all, that women are more likely to do this than men. And all the things I show you, it's always a significant difference. Then there is a difference by age again. I mean, in general, people do it, right? So this is also accessible behavior, I guess. And then we also see, again, that the youngest, 15 to 19, slightly more than in the groups just above them. Or we also have items where the differences are less pronounced. So this one, I avoid buying fast fashion like Uniqlo or GU, or buying something from Shein. And here, this, you can see that it's not such a clear pattern. The differences are still significant, but it's not meaningful really to interpret them. And this can be, I would imagine that maybe for the older respondents it's possibly less relevant. Otherwise, I guess Uniqlo, GU, everybody buys it. So, yeah, and there we see for the 20-year-old groups, we actually have a few more who say that they do maybe think about it. Okay, but the general trend is this. So, summing this up here. Now let me move on to climate knowledge. How do we measure this? We had several more items but I selected the 3 ones that are most plausible and I guess also most accessible knowledge about climate change. So 3 items where respondents could say, is this true, is this false, or I don't know. Like most of the current climate change is due to greenhouse gases generated by human activity, or rise in sea levels and droughts increase as a consequence of climate change, etc. So we had more, and they're not all coded in the same direction, etc. But from this, we also created a composite index from 0 to 1, where the don't know response we actually counted in the middle. But okay, so this is it. Who's likely to have more climate knowledge? The youngest, so 15 to 19-year-old, and the older age groups have highest climate knowledge, and again, also people with higher education. Just to show you the trend, this is it. So in general, they all kind of look the same in terms of patterns. But so people with higher education have slightly higher percentages of people who got this correct or answered correctly. And you can see how across the age groups, the older groups have more knowledge of this. The pattern is the same for all these items. And the 20 and 30-year-olds or 20 to 39-year-olds, that group, only half of these age groups knew the correct answer or were willing to engage in the question. You can always also argue that if somebody says, I don't know, they just can't be bothered maybe. But the youngest, they know more, and that could maybe be a reflection of changed curriculum in schools since 2020, where they have now a stronger focus on climate change. And when I talk to my students who are still in that cohort before that, they didn't really learn that much, very much depending on the school. But I think now this may be something we can see here. Okay, let me move on. Climate emotions. For this, we used a lot of items, so I have to explain a lot. We have a composite index of 9 different climate emotions. So first, here I list up 5 of them, and they come mainly from other surveys from around the world where we just picked them out and measured them here also. So I worry about the next generation because they will be drastically affected by climate change, or the next one is like really quite a combination of grief and worry. So I'm terrified by how many things have changed in just a few years because of climate change, or this feeling of losing something. I feel a sense of loss because of climate change impacts that are becoming apparent in my local area, or also something like guilt. I feel guilty about the fact that my lifestyle is in part responsible for climate change. And one more about being anxious about the changes. And then we also included some additional items that we developed. We kind of thought about, not necessarily Zikard and I, but with the Japanese members of the group, we did think about what are maybe items that can measure what climate emotions are in the context of Japan. So can we add something to these other emotions? And so we created some items that for now I call them climate nostalgia, something like the first one. So due to climate change, I feel that landscapes and natural sounds, such as the sound of cicadas or the murmuring of rivers, are being lost. And we have several ones. They are all asked within the context of climate change. So even if the actual statement doesn't contain the word climate change, it's clear that that's what is tapped into. So even something like, I feel sad thinking about the loss of cultural practices rooted in the seasons, or I feel heartache when I think future generations might not know the Japan I grew up in. So it's all clear that this is about losing specific seasonal changes. Danke, vielen Dank. Okay, so who's more worried? I already said women. And then the youngest, 15 to 19, they have strong negative climate emotions, so these fears and worries, and also older age groups, 50 plus. Also slightly more worried are people with higher education levels and also people who have children, but these differences are really quite small. Some examples. So I worry about the next generation because they will be drastically affected by climate change. So here you can see that women feel this slightly stronger, and otherwise we have similar patterns as usual. So here the 20 to 49-year-olds are relatively similar in feeling this to a lesser extent maybe, and you can see how the youngest group has stronger emotional engagement. Then I'm terrified about how many things have changed in just a few years because of climate change. I think here the argument could be that this is something you can only feel if you have lived a long time and you see a lot of changes, but our data shows that that may not really be the case. So again, women feel this stronger. The older age groups have a stronger emotional engagement there, but the youngest also, you can see, do feel this. So they do respond to this. So it's not just about how long you have witnessed changes. This is one of the Japanese specific, let me call it that way, items where we can see the same pattern. Again, women feel this more, and there's pretty linear difference across age groups where these items evoke stronger emotional responses amongst the older groups. But also again in the youngest group. Okay, so now I introduced the different measures. Now let's take a look at how these different concepts relate to each other, right? So first of all, knowledge about climate change, how does that impact on climate-friendly behavior? But in general, maybe just a quick background. So to look at how these concepts are interrelated, we ran just simple OLS regression models. And in these models, we always include control variables, so gender, age, education, etc., as listed up at the bottom. I hope you can see that at the back, maybe a bit hard to see. And what that means is that all the differences that we find here for how knowledge and emotions are related to climate-friendly behavior, they are really true effects of that without any impact of how old somebody is, etc., right? So that's controlled out of this relationship. So first of all, I'm just looking at the impact of knowledge about climate change on climate-friendly behavior. One more thing I should mention is that overall knowledge and emotions are the strongest predictors of climate-friendly behavior, much stronger than any of the control variables, and stronger than differences by age, etc. So this is really something that is impactful. So the direct total effect, or the total effect, I should say, of climate knowledge on behavior is this. So this is the standardized coefficient for this, and how do you interpret this? It's a modest but meaningful effect, but it's very likely that knowledge doesn't impact climate-friendly behavior just like that directly, but that part of that is filtered through how people feel about the whole thing, right? So emotional reaction that is evoked by the knowledge about climate change is likely to filter this relationship. So we look at this as a mediation model, and there we find that about 43% of the effect of knowledge on climate change actually goes through climate emotions. So we have an indirect effect of 0.122, and then the direct effect of just knowledge on behavior becomes a little bit smaller. And maybe I don't really need my paper. Maybe it's easier if I do it without. We at the same time also find the direct effect of climate emotion. So what this means overall is that emotions amplify the impact of climate knowledge. They kind of activate that knowledge into action, you can say. It kind of helps translate it into, it makes people become active. But at the same time, emotions, these climate emotions also have an independent effect on their own. So with the same amount of knowledge, if somebody feels emotionally touched by this topic or not, will make it more or less likely whether they will act. So the emotions themselves are also impactful. I hope that makes sense. Okay, let me move on just a little bit more. So, however, there are also emotions that may have a different kind of effect. Where am I going? Just a second. So the same emotion which in some countries, or sociocultural contexts, I should say, may encourage climate-friendly behavior like shame. So Sieghart, in his part, you heard me present, talked about the study in Sweden where feeling shameful about taking action that is bad for the environment made people not do that, kind of prevented climate-damaging behavior. So, however, the same emotion, this shame, can be a hindrance to climate-friendly behavior in this case, the context of Japan. So we ask questions about what kind of hurdles people, what are things that make you or prevent you from taking these climate-friendly actions that we listed up before. And one of the things that we asked about was feeling embarrassed about it or not wanting to be seen as somebody who's overly conscious or radical by peers, essentially. And for the younger respondents, this really had an impact. So this kind of shows that behaviors in Japan that are perceived as being against the social norm are behaviors that people tend to avoid because it will, it may mean that they are not being accepted by peers or by other groups, social groups, etc., or they don't want to be like cause meiwaku or something like that. But what that also means is that climate-friendly behaviors are perceived as something that is against the norm, right? So this is kind of the implication. So climate-friendly behavior perceived there as a norm violation. That's, I think, quite interesting and tells us something about how that is framed. This does not apply to a huge amount of people or a large share of people, but nevertheless. So this is it. So we asked them, so this is the statement, so I'd feel embarrassed if others around me would find out about doing such activities, like these climate-friendly things. And we see that amongst the younger age groups, this is something that is, not huge shares of respondents, but some parts of the younger groups say, yeah, that applies to me. So they would rather not do it. I asked my students about this, and they also said, like, yeah, there are, situations where everybody wants to go and buy that one huge plastic drink. That's now the latest trend. And it just, you wouldn't really say, okay, maybe we shouldn't because it's bad for the environment. It's kind of, you're the party pooper, and it would not really be acceptable. So it's not really something that is so on people's mind, maybe. Okay, now let me come to my conclusion, which I have divided into different sections. So first of all, conclusion, or rather more a summary of the things that we find. So who does or does not care about the climate crisis? So I showed you a lot of data, and I'm trying to sum it up a little bit. So a large majority is concerned, first of all, but interest has weakened over the past few years. Climate knowledge is higher amongst older adults and amongst the youngest group, and also amongst those with higher education, even though the difference is not huge for education. Climate emotions are higher among women. They're higher amongst older adults and amongst the youngest group, and again, amongst those with higher education and those who have children. Interest in climate change. There, let me add a little bit more of information because I still have a ton more, lots more things that I could show, but it's just too long. So I know that you probably would want to know. So what else is it, right, apart from age, etc.? So interest in climate change is lower among people also who have low interest in politics or lower interest in politics, who don't like to spend time in nature. That is also something that is very much related to this, who tend to who say they would rather choose to watch something entertaining than watch the news. Also, people who use and trust SNS more. So we ask different questions there. So just that's like a super short summing up that part, which I think may also be helpful in the discussion. Then young adults, they have the lowest concern, the lowest interest, lower climate knowledge and emotions, and are less likely to engage in climate-friendly behavior. So they are really kind of the problem group to target, I guess. And then the youngest group, they may be profiting from more focus on climate change in schools, and there we need to wait and see whether that continues or whether they then just get busy with life and it kind of goes away. We don't know yet. But this, I think, is very core to if you want to tackle low interest. What role do climate emotions play? So both climate knowledge and climate emotions are linked to climate-friendly behavior, and knowledge does matter, it's important, but part of its impact is activated through climate emotions. And climate emotions also have a strong independent effect. So it's not bad if people are worried about the climate crisis. It's not all about becoming depressive and whatever, and then going into denial, or I don't think that's really the story for most people, but it is really something that makes people become active. We also find that in our qualitative interviews. So people who feel more emotional engagement, they also take more action, even when they have the same level of climate knowledge. For Japan's specific findings, I mean, these findings, this would also be similar in a different country, I guess. So some emotions like shame, embarrassment, they seem to be more of something that discourages climate-friendly behavior, or we found that it seems to be perceived, at least by some, as something that's against norms. Also, climate emotions, we do find people really responded well to these items, and they also work well when we look at how these different constructs interrelate. So climate emotions, I think, are or could be deeply tied to cultural identity, and it's questionable what that really is, right? Including feelings of loss and nostalgia about landscapes and specifically seasons and traditions here in Japan, which I think is something that people do care about deeply. And I think also across generations, even though it's becoming highly commercialized also. So last slide, high concern, low interest, the puzzle revisited. Well, I don't have a response at all to this, but people in Japan are highly concerned, yet many are not truly interested or engaged. So this is really tricky. The data shows that knowledge matters, but emotional engagement transforms understanding into action. And so climate change is a threat to, or can be perceived as a threat. It is actually to something deeply meaningful, something beyond just ecological losses, but also kind of a loss of cultural identity, etc. So these landscapes, seasonal rhythms, and cultural identity tied to nature. I think since last year, there's also talk about how Japan may be changing from 4 seasons to just 2 seasons. And this is a highly emotional discussion, at least from what I saw about it. But it's also not like a huge discussion. You could make more of this, I think. So my question, and I'm not really sure about this yet, but maybe if communication about the climate crisis could also tap into these emotional connections, maybe we could turn concern into interest and then interest into climate action. But this is something where we would, or now I would, love to hear your thoughts on this. I think there's a lot more that we need to discuss. So thank you very much for your attention.